Добра вечер од моја страна. Благодарам што сте тука на оваа сесија на нашиот проект критичко преиспитување на правото на правниот и факултет за политички науки. Оваа сесија имаме чест, имаме еден драг и distinguished guest, познат гостин на наше задоволство од филозофи професор од Българија, Boyan Manchev. За неговиот лик и дело, нешто повеќе каже нашата фабулозна асистентка на проектот Вики Младенова подоцна. Без чиј напор, морам да кажам, може би немаше да биде возможен, концепцијски и организацијски овој настап. Моја само да кажам дека проектот го водиме во 4 под дела, речеме биополитика и право, мултикултурализам и право, авторитаризам и право и психоанализа и право. Во сезоната од септември го чекуваме Младен Долари, може би Салица или Рената од Словенечката школа на психоанализа да од тој дел ќе донесе на проектот, имам некакви договори, мислам известно дека ќе дојдат. И од сето тоа може би ќе излезе и негов текст и овој бит на крај. Значи, уште еднаш големо задоволство што го имаме Boyan Manchev тука вечерно со нас. Он ќе зборува така како што сака, на англиски, на бугарски, whatever, ќе се удиме да го следиме. И повеќе немам што да кажам, ќе предадам збор на Вики Младенова да каже нешто за ликот и делото на Boyan Manchev. Благодарам.
Благодарам многу што дојдовте. Јас само многу кратко биографски податоци за Boyan Manchev ќе ви кажам. Редовно предава на новиот бугарски универзитет и Берлинскиот универзитет за уметност. Исто така како визитинг професор се појави на Холинс University, како и на Софискиот универзитет. Бивш програмски директор и подпредседател е на Меѓународниот филозофски коледж во Париз. Последните 2 декади творечкиот фокус на Манчев е насочен на онтологијата, политичката филозофија и филозофијата на уметноста. Некои од неговите последни книги се Метеор 2018, Облаци 2017, Логика на политическото 2012, По никое време или Out of Time 2011, Тялото метаморфоза 2007. Покрај книги тој пишува и друг вид на текстови, има такви околу 200 на број. Тоа прилика темата за која што вечер тој ќе збори е насловена како формата на човекот, политичка свитливост и економија на формите на живот. Поголем дел од предавањето ќе биде концентрирано на работата која што веќе има опфатено со логика на политическото. Јас нема да дадам никаков посебен повед во предавањето, за да нема таков сугестивен дел. Делот тоа што ќе се зборува вечер веќе беше презентирано во поканите до вас за настанот. Пред Бојан да настапи, јас само сакам да изразам огромна благодарност од моје лично име на тимот на критичко преиспитување на правото до Славчо Димитров за неговата поддршка, подкрепа и всушност овозможување на ова гостување на Boyan Manchev. Ви благодарам уште еднаш многу на сите што дојдовте и се надевам дека ќе се среќаваме во наредни прилики во рамки на овој проект. Благодарам многу.
So first of all, I really want to express my great pleasure and gratitude to be here in this wonderful space in the Museum for Contemporary Art in Skopje. I am for the first time here, and I already feel very much excited about the discussions that I already had, and this is really a great stimulus to be in an even more dynamic exchange with my friends and colleagues from Skopje. I especially want to thank Professor Frečkovski and Vicky Mladenova, but also Slavcho Dimitrov for their very generous efforts to make this visit possible. And for also the, how should I say, the input that they gave me to go back to a material that in a way was a little bit distant already from my ongoing work. So what I'm going to present tonight is a material that I was busy with the last decade, and mostly during my seminars in Paris around 15 years ago, and only lately they were published in Bulgarian in the book Logic of the Political, and part of this corpus will also appear this year in French under the title Persister, which means to persist. So, in a way, we discussed even in details the topic of tonight's lecture, and I realized that perhaps I could even propose more adequate perspective to enter the proposal of this very, how should I say, rich invitation, conceptual invitation of the project Critical Re-examination of Law, and especially one of its features, which is dealing with the concept of biopolitics. So what I'm going to present tonight is not that much dealing with the political hermeneutics of classical tragedy that I was announcing in the beginning, because perhaps this is a little bit too far from our topic, but the book is with me, and I brought some last copies that the publisher found almost by miracle for some of the students of Professor Frečkovski and younger colleagues. So perhaps if there is one copy for the library, you can also browse this. And now I'm going mostly to focus on the second volume, or the second part of this research, and respectively of this book, which is dealing with the contemporary debate on biopolitics. Nevertheless, I will start with a short, let's say, fabula, with a short story, which is connected to the most definitely famous classical text, Sophocles' Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Tyrannus. Maybe the king is not the right translation of this title. I'll read this shortly without commenting. This is really sort of a research hypothesis that will have certain allegoric potential for my critical re-examination of the concept of biopolitics and its relation to the, let's say, the question of political order, but also juridical order. What we discussed in advance with my hosts is that I will present the lecture mostly in Bulgarian, for the simple reason that the initial corpus was written in French, then translated in Bulgarian, so I never really dealt with it in English. But for me, it is important that there is a how should I say, easy understanding of my arguments. So on one hand, I'm trying to make short synthesis if you're losing the flow. And then there is my colleague and friend Stanimir Panayotov, who is Bulgarian and who is fluent in both languages, so he can back me up if needed to introduce certain concepts that might be ununderstandable. So this was my introduction, then I moved to my job. Thank you very much for that. So let me first read my fabula, my fable. Okay, then maybe I will use this fable on Oedipus, just to tell you that in this political hermeneutics that I proposed of the classical tragic text, In fact, I tried to read classical tragedy as a genuinely political text. And I realized that not everybody is seeing me, so I maybe don't in that position. And my task was to use, let's say, anthropological and cultural historical instruments in order to suggest that we have exemplary narrative on the foundation of political order in classical tragedy, and especially in Oedipus the King. So this was my, let's say, preliminary hypothesis. Furthermore, in connection to that, of course, I read classical tragedy or tragic text as, let's say, exemplary anthropotechnical narrative as well. So my hypothesis was that classical tragedy has the task to present an exemplary story on how human being is becoming human, and he or she is becoming a human. In the Greek case, unfortunately, this is rather he. You know why? Is becoming a human by means of entering the political order, the political form of organization, which in this case is also political juridical order. And for me, the big paradox from that point of view was why Oedipus the King, if we assume that Oedipus is in a way the hero, so to say, or the incarnation of the Logos. So he's, as you remember, let's say the first Greek hero who is using, perhaps after Ulysses, but Ulysses is using rather mythos, so he's tricking the powers and the gods, and Oedipus is using the power of his Logos when he's confronting this chthonic beast, this zoic power, which is the Sphinx, the female beast, which we usually call the Sphinx, but it is a female monster. And you know what is this logical weapon that Oedipus is destroying the monster with? This is an answer of a riddle, of an enigma. The Greek word for a riddle is enigma. Is it okay with the mic for the?
No.
Okay. So, because I have a little bit this very pathetic side, so if I move, then I'll hold the microphone. Thank you very much. So, so the big question was why, if Oedipus is the, let's say, the hero of Logos, who is in a way embodying the new powers and exemplifying the foundation of political order, why is it so that he fails? As we know very well, the plague is back in the city, in the polis of Thebes, and the evil is back, and there is a corruption, the community is suffering, and the new king has to face the evil. And he's making some sort of a logical investigation. He's reading a lot of science. It's really a semiotic exercise in a way. And at the end, he succeeds to confront, let's say, the double bottom of the riddle that he has presumably answered. And he realizes, this is my reading, right? It's not in the tragic text, but what Oedipus realizes is that, in fact, the answer of the riddle was wrong. Remember the riddle of the Sphinx? The riddle was, what is this creature that in the morning walks on 4 paths, in midday at 2, on 2, and in the evening at 3? And Oedipus' answer, which is in a way indexical answer, he said, the human, myself, the human subject. And so this answer was in a way the lethal weapon to destroy the monster. So there is a new power, new form, if you wish, new ontological form in a way, entering this chthonic, archaic order of the monstrous powers, and it annihilates the monstrosity, the ancient archaic monstrosity. So Oedipus is the human, right? And he, the human, becomes a king, a sovereign. Well, it's much more complicated, and I don't have now time to enter in details of this, what I call political hermeneutics, but it's obvious that I go against the most powerful interpretation of this myth in at least in modernity, which is the Freudian interpretation. So I read this text as genuinely political text. So what is the double bottom of the riddle, of the enigma? Well, it's a semantic paradox, because the answer that Oedipus gave, the human, in fact, was not the correct answer precisely for the semiotic order of the Greek world at the time. And for that semiotic order, a creature that is multiplying or changing the number of his or her organs, his legs or paths in this context, is called a monster. So, and that's what is revealed, that in fact the one that wanted to establish a new order has disrupted, he has made a hubris, he has challenged not only the divine order, but he has challenged the order that he himself wanted to establish. You know why? Because he killed his own father, which means that he interrupted the genealogical order, etc., etc. And of course, he transgressed also the taboo of the incest. So this was my initial hypothesis, which tried to show also the therapeutic character of Greek tragedy, because of course in the Athenian space in antiquity, the Greek tragedy was perceived as political text, and the assumptions were very clear. These monstrosities, this ancient archaic monstrosity, has to stay out there in the polis of Thebes. Here in Athens, such thing doesn't happen. So, and that's a little bit the political, let's say, instrumentalization of tragedy, if we might call it like that, because of course it was in a way a therapeutic exercise for the entire community. And there are a lot of markers, semantic markers or narrative markers in classical tragedy, which show that usually the solution of the tragic plot comes either from the goddess patron of the town of Athens, which is of course Pallas Athena, or it happens in the physical space of Athens, which is, by the way, the case of Oedipus, but not in Oedipus the king. In the third tragedy of the trilogy, which is Oedipus in Colonos. And what is Colonos? Colonos is something like outskirts of Athens, where at the end Oedipus finds peace with himself and with the divine order. So there is this kind of closure of the circle. Anyway, so for me, this ideal narrative was read in many phases, which I don't have now time to introduce, as I said, with a lot of material from anthropology and cultural history. But what is interesting for me, in fact, is how certain figures of our modern concepts for politics and law and our idea of the human or of the human as form were in a way articulated at that time. Of course, unlike one of the philosophers, a colleague that I'm going to discuss in a while, I'm quite skeptical about this direct transposition of a classical material in our modern time, so I don't think that we can directly transpose this classical material and say, okay, this is the idea of sovereignty, or this is the idea of human form that functions up to nowadays. I think this is grotesque. But what I try to say is that through a series of historic re-articulations, and especially by, in a way, by reading the Greek text always as a foundational text and as a sort of a, how should I say, exemplary text, we re-narrate or re-articulate our conceptual vocabulary and respectively instruments. So what I want you to keep for now from this very short fabula, from this mythos, is the paradox of sovereignty. So the one that establishes the sovereign order is the one who is excluded from it, but he is excluded by the very power, let's say by the counter move of the very foundational act. So that's the constitutive paradox of the foundation of political order in my reading. And now I'm moving to a very different context and discussion and debate, in which I only later will try to bring in this classical, let's say, allegory. And this debate is, of course, the debate around the notion of biopolitics. But not only the notion of biopolitics, but rather around a very influential contemporary use, or I would even say instrumentalization, of the classical ideas of life in connection to this modern concept of biopolitics elaborated in the few last decades in thinkers like, let's say, Michel Foucault or Antonio Negri. And I'm referring here to an Italian philosopher that is very well known in the last 3 decades. His name is, of course, Giorgio Agamben. I remind you that I was giving these seminars and was working in this material 15 years ago. This is precisely in the years his book series, at the time it was only 2, Homo Sacer, and the second volume, which was L'état d'exception, State of Exception, which appeared in 2003, became extremely influential. And this was not without connection with the war in the Gulf, and the previous book had abundant reference to the situation in former Yugoslavia and the Yugoslavian war. So this is extremely relevant also for our historical context, at least 20 years ago. I don't think there is a need to resume this thesis, but what I'm going to suggest is two, let's say, critical points. The first one is on the use of perhaps the most famous concept in this political corpus of Giorgio Agamben, which is the concept of bare life. I made this semantic pause because this is a tricky thing how to translate this concept. Vita nuda, vie nue, mere life, simple life, bare life, or naked life. It's a very meaningful, let's say, decision, because it has a very big, also not only semantic, but also political consequences. And I'm sure many of you know why. Because this concept, which became famous through the work of Agamben, is in fact the concept of another, much more perhaps famous and influential philosopher, who is Walter Benjamin. And the notion that we translate now as bare life, I don't know how it would be in Macedonian, Bulgarian say gol život, Although it's just in brackets, the Bulgarian translation says ogolem život. I know the translator, I don't want to criticize her, but I disagree with this translation. Because ogolem would suggest that you first were dressed and then you were undressed, right? It's like a striptease, you know? And that's not what is meant, right? So, because obviously this idea of bareness is connected to a certain idea of substance, right? Of substance, of human substance, even reduced to a certain minimum, but still there is a relic of idea of substance. And this is something I'll go back to. But what is the situation with Benjamin? Well, let me quote. Since I'm using here the Bulgarian text, I'll have to quote in Bulgarian, but maybe I'll try to sum it up in English. So the original title is Como sacer il potere sovrano e la nuda vita, I'm speaking in Spanish, e la nuda vita, 95, and I would say by the force of some really peculiar confusion, this book was translated in German as Konversation, die souveräne Macht und das nackte Leben. Das nackte. And for me, this is a really tremendous problem, because for many reasons, because this goes back to a very ambiguous and even repulsive discourse that Agamben is dealing with related to the concentration camps, and because apparently the German translators were not taking into account the fact that the concept of Agamben has German origin, and it comes from the famous Benjamin's text, the Kritik der Gewalt, the critique of violence, where the German expression is das bloße Leben, which we can translate as just life, mere sheer life, or by the way, the very Benjaminian expression is coming, I think it's a clear reference to the Hobbesian tradition, and Hobbes speaks in Leviathan of life pure and simple. So I think this would be a synonymous translation, maybe too heavy, right? Life pure and simple, sheer life, absolutely. So, and what is the context in which Benjamin introduces this term? Here I will need to quote in Bulgarian because I don't have the German or the English translation. So, in fact, it's a paragraph where Walter Benjamin criticized, and this is quite interesting in the eve of the Pride weekend, because he's criticizing not, let's say, a right-wing or a vitalist, conservative thinker. He's criticizing a person whose name is Kurt Hiller. I don't know if it's Kurt Hiller was a very famous figure at the time. There is a small square in Berlin, Schöneberg, and Kurt Hiller was the director of the first Institute for Sexual Studies in Berlin, and of course he had to flee afterwards and to move to London, since he was both Jew and homosexual. And in fact he was one of the first activists of the movement in Berlin, and a very important figure. At the same time, his political positions were quite pacifist. And the unbearable thing about bare life with Benjamin is due precisely to the pacifist position of Kurt Hiller. And here I quote, and this is, even in Bulgarian, it's a little bit hard because the translation is brilliant. It's made by a very famous Bulgarian philosopher who unfortunately recently passed away in quite tragic circumstances, I would say, so I really want to mention him. He was a friend of mine. His name is Dimitri. And but his Bulgarian is somewhat strange as well, so perhaps it will need some hermeneutic effort. So he is translating the following. First is quote by Kurt Hiller, who says, "Ако не убия, то никога повече няма да съградя световното царство на справедливостта." Така мисли духовният терорист. Но ние изповядваме, че по-високо от щастието и праведността на едно съществуване стои съществуването само по себе си. This was Kurt Hiller. So the existence itself is superior to just existence. And then Benjamin's comment, he says, невярно и ниско е изречението, че съществуването стояло по-високо от правилното съществуване. Ако съществуване не трябва нищо друго, освен сам единия живот. Сам единия живот is very archaic in Bulgarian as well. It's mere life. So what Benjamin says is that he finds Kurt Hiller's statement, pacifist statement, as repulsive. Because what he believes is that existence as such doesn't have any value, or not any, but it cannot be hypothesized or extrapolated as superior value. For him, dignity is life. There is no such adjective, dignity, but let's say just life, fair life, or life in dignity is the value, decent, right? So, I don't want to enter in the hermeneutical details of Benjamin's text, which I'm sure many of you know, and it's quite complicated, and in my reading at least, what he is suggesting at the end is some sort of, let's say, conceptual argument in support of revolutionary violence. Because this göttliche Gewalt, this divine violence that he's speaking of, in my reading, is identical to revolutionary violence. But this is something which makes the affair even more complicated, because the way Giorgio Agamben is using this term is, in a way, semantically, but also politically opposite. So, and this creates an incredible semantic but also political confusions. And since we are in the Museum of Contemporary Art, I can give you an example, although I'm not dealing with contemporary art today, but in my practice and even daily life, I deal quite a lot with art and artists. And I can, for instance, refer to one of the documentas at the time, 2005, curated by two Austrian curators. They even made a feature on their life, completely reading, misunderstanding the notion of bare life, which in a way was extremely, I mean, in this tempo of contemporary art was a very, I would say, delicate situation. Bare life was really read as sort of a sanctity of life, related to, today I'm sure that this reading would give reference to migrants as bare life, which for me would be completely shocking. But and especially it would be shocking in terms of the Benjamin's critical proposal. So you see, this is something that I wanted to emphasize on, because it's not just a bad intention towards Agamben, because Agamben's book is very complex one. It's quite, how should I say, it's unclear in its directions. But what is there at stake is very interesting for us, when especially we are discussing the critical re-examination of law. This is, so to say, the practical, or practical is maybe a weak word, I would say the dynamic power of a philosophical concept. I mean, can a philosophical concept, or is this something that we need to expect from a philosophical concept, to pass into action, or to become active, or to provoke actions. If so, I think we have a very big responsibility, at least philosophers, but all thinkers, towards their own instruments. So we need to definitely critically re-examine our own systems of thought and our own instruments. And since without being an orthodox Marxist, I still believe that philosophy needs to be a praxis of transformation, I do believe also in this practical power of concepts. And from that point of view, I find the nuda vita, or Nacht 11 even more, as a very problematic concept. So it can, of course, it serves mostly emancipatory causes, mostly progressive, left-wing, let's say, broadly speaking, activities. But then the ambiguity of its conceptual background makes it a very slippery ground for further actions. And precisely my second point will deal with, let's say, the prospective modality of the analysis of Giorgio Agamben's, when he tries, via many, let's say, conceptual phases, he tries to envision or to imagine, on his own term, a possible, let's say, practical dimension or aspect of his critical proposal. And you know that in his books there are a lot of concepts that he introduces. Most of them are taken by Hannah Arendt, by Carl Schmitt, by Antonio Negri, but it's a kind of a Maurice Blanchot. It's a very eclectic, but very original at the same time in its eclecticism work. But what remains unclear is the outcome. So what Giorgio Agamben, as a political thinker in this context, suggests. And I'm sure you know that what he is suggesting at the end of not that much the first volume of Hauptsatz, but in the second book, State of Exception, since he assumes that we are now living in a situation of, universal state of exception, of generalized state of exception, where precisely the state of emergency becomes the law. Therefore, in his analysis, since the nuda vita, bare life, Bloßenleben, is this, so to say, space of indistinguishability of life and law, so we live in sort of, where he says this, the necessity to deal with bare life, understood the way he understands it, is becoming an ultimate task of political thinking and also of political practice. And what is his only solution? His only solution is to suggest against this generalized state of exception, which is in a way a state of limitless sovereignty, because of course he's referring to Carl Schmitt's definition of the sovereignty. The sovereign is the one who decides on the state of exception. He tries to oppose another, let's say, structure that would suspend the very state of suspension of law, which is the state of emergency. So it's again a sort of a meta operation, suspension of a suspension, and in his proposal, again, Agamben is rereading Benjamin, and I'm dealing with the details of this analysis in my book. So how although he's a brilliant reader, I think he's rereading in a very slippery way other Benjamin's texts, the theological political fragment, and especially on the concept of history. And at the end, he is trying to say that the solution proposed by Walter Benjamin was the messianic suspension of law. And that's precisely the suspension of the suspension that Giorgio Agamben is writing about, while in my reading this is fundamentally wrong. Walter Benjamin's suggestion was revolutionary action and not messianic suspension of law, which is something very different. And I'll try to, this part of my analysis, to present in more details. So to provide some more philosophical density of my argument. So here for a while I will read from my Bulgarian text. In fact, the original is in French, so it's already a translation, and then, if needed, I'll make a short summary. Месианистичното събитие води към анулирането на суверенното решение, т.е. към радикалното прекъсване на самата структура на суверенната власт. Въпреки че в книгата си Езикът и смъртта, Language and Death, Agamben се противопоставя на прочутата теза на Жорж Батай върху суверенността. Тезата на Жорж Батай е La souveraineté n'est rien. The sovereignty is nothing. It's a very enigmatic phrase, and I'm very close to Bataille in many ways, so I have much more books on Bataille, or close to Bataille, in proximity to Bataille, so I'm not going to enter in this, but what I suggest is that, in fact, as if this empty messianic event is claiming, in accordance with Bataille, sovereignty is nothing. However, Agamben transformed the Bataille's thesis in an unhistorical project, in a, so to say, finality without an end. It's a quote of Kant's, of course, finality without an end, of the political. При него, връщам се на български, Agamben, образът на постполитическото състояние или на политическото в точния смисъл на понятието, доколкото политическото би започвало там, където свършва суверенната власт, отговаря на нищото на суверенността, на една суверенност без функция. Une souveraineté sans emploi. По аналогия с négativité sans emploi, which means negativity without function of Bataille. And here I will just give you a quote by Agamben, which for me is quite striking. It's a very beautiful image or allegory, but it's quite hard to understand its political content. And it is the following. Един ден човечеството ще играе с правото така, както децата играят с предметите вън от употреба. Не за да ги върнат към тяхната обичайна употреба, а за да ги освободят окончателно от нея. Това, което идва след правото, не е една по-същностна и по-начална потребителна стойност, а една нова употреба, която се появява единствено след него. Do I need to? Yeah. So one day humanity will play with law in a way that children play with their toys, not with their toys, with objects, but with not out of use, not in order to bring them back to their initial use value, original use value, but in order to liberate them once and for all for the use value. What comes after law is not a more essential and originary use value of law, but its new use. So, for me this remained very enigmatic. This is, by the way, a quote from State of Exception, at the very end of the book. After receiving a lot of criticism, many powerful thinkers at the time, including Jacques Derrida, we were discussing this today. So he's much more careful, so he speaks of their life now as a product of sort of anthropotechnical machine, which is a very big difference to the first volume, compared to the first volume. Anyways, in this image of playing with law as with objects out of use is quite a peculiar one. So what does it mean? I don't know what it means, but definitely it's not a political project. It's a utopian vision, or retro-utopian vision, because what comes after is precisely, although he's saying it's not an originally use value of law, what comes after is precisely a description of a sort of a retro-utopian originary state of humankind in its originary form. And I'll quote, this time I'll directly translate myself in English. So, he says, it's from another book, it's from Means Without Ends, a small book, very interesting one. So he says, the politics is what connects to the essential worklessness, inoperativity. The Italian word is inoperosità of humankind. Politics is what is connected to the essential inoperativity, worklessness, being without work of humankind, of the radical being without work of human communities. If there is politics, it is because human beings are argos, beings which cannot be defined by any existing operation, which means beings of pure potentiality, which non-identity or vocation can exhaust. You see, it's a very beautiful and a very retro-utopian image, because it speaks of a lost origin of humankind. So we have inoperosità, which is the Italian translation of a very complex and enigmatic concept coming from the French philosophy, which I'm sure Slavko knows quite well. This is a concept coming traditionally connected to Maurice Blanchot, and the concept is désœuvrement. Désœuvrement in English we tend to translate as precisely inoperativity or worklessness, but literally it means being without œuvre, without opus, without work and œuvre at the same time. So, in fact, it doesn't come from Blanchot, it rather comes from Giorgio, or even in my reading from Bataille, but that's hermeneutical debate, so it's not so interesting, and it became very important in political philosophy after Jean-Luc Nancy's book La Communauté des œuvres from 86. So this is 10 years later, so Agamben is quite influenced, I think, implicitly by this book, and what he suggests precisely as a horizon of the political action, as a result of this messianic suspension of law, which obviously is identical to this children play, is precisely a state of inoperativity, a state of worklessness, which on one hand sounds fascinating. I would really want to stay désœuvré, spend time, and I don't want to ridiculize this idea because it's a very profound idea, but I don't think this could be a horizon for political action. So that was the main, let's say, perspective of my critical approach towards Agamben. So as you see, I presented my lecture rather as a synthesis in English, rather as the text itself. So I'll also close it in a similar fashion. So as I announced, I'll speak 45 minutes, so I have around 10 more minutes. And in these 10 minutes, I'll just try to enter a parallel or alternative perspective, also bringing in the initial constitutive paradox that I was dealing with, and also trying to suggest alternative vision to the Agamben's one. As I said, I'm grateful to my hosts for precisely this invitation, because this made me rethink this already old corpus, also in the perspective of my ongoing work, which is quite a very different phenomenon. I wrote a book called Oblaci, I don't know if it's the same word in Macedonian, Clouds, Philosophy of the Free Body, which is much more dealing with ontology, but again, with the question of freedom and freedom of body, which is the question at stake, after all, in these political discussions. This is the question also of biopolitics, how bodies' potentiality is captured, co-opted by certain systems of production, and how it could be possibly emancipated. So, okay, very briefly, my first intuition, since I mentioned already Marx, I think we have a big gap in, or a missing aspect in the analysis of Agamben's, and of course this aspect, because he's so much focused, anyway, hypostasizing, I don't know if I can say this in French, the juridico-political matter, that he's completely putting in brackets the economic dimension, or political-economical dimension of the issues of biopolitics. Of course, he's very much influenced by the operaist and post-operaist thought, directly by Negri, perhaps by Virno. Nevertheless, there is no, or very rudimentary later, analysis of economic reality. And for me, that remains the big insufficiency, which causes also a lot of the conceptual paradoxes in Agamben's proposals. So, this is perhaps the reason to think revolution as a messianic act instead of social, political, or historical action. He doesn't analyze means of production, he doesn't analyze forms of exchange or production, which I think is substantial for such task. And here I'll propose a few reflections around the notion of biopolitics, which I take again from the book, and I made a synthesis for you. Maybe in order to not waste too much time, I'll try for last time to read a little bit in Bulgarian. Maybe this time studying you can back me up a bit. Or if it doesn't work, I'll try to translate myself, but I think this delays me. So it's about an alternative proposal to think on biopolitics, respectively. I'll try also to read what for me is easier to process in English. I'll go directly. So, in fact, my work around this concept of biopolitics was reaction to both Agamben and also Paulo Virno in the famous book Grammar of the Multitude, where very, very influential for me, but there is one point in Virno's argument which I find strikingly problematic, where he says that the contemporary capitalist forms have entirely captured the potentiality of human life. And this means there is no way out. So that it's a complete catastrophe if this was true. And I'm reminding you also this paradox of sovereignty that I was talking about, so I try to read in a similar way contemporary hegemony and the way it sabotages its own power. And now I'm going to read it. И така, както се опитах да покажа в работа от предходните десетилетия, посредством въвеждането и аргументирането на понятието перформативен капитализъм, биополитическата операция представлява нещо повече от всмукване, absorption of potentiality of life. There is no exploited substance of life. What we are dealing with today is a sort of a performance of the forms of life. So, in order to go to the end of the critical operation of desubstantialization of the questions of subject or political subject, legal order and political order, it is necessary to abandon the post-vitalist intuition of an immanent potentiality of life, which is a sort of a relict of the logic of the substance and the individual. The only potential, or the only potentiality, is those of singular subjects which are becoming subjects through complex operations which I, in alternative to biopolitics, tend to call techno-aesthetic, referring to the etymological, of course, dimension of the Greek words techne and aesthesis. And therefore, biopolitics, in the first place, should be understood as a production and also absorptions of technai, of techniques of subjectivation. So, the principle of the economic equivalence is reducing them to substance. In my work, I don't have time to get into this detail. I was going back to Marx and even to Hegel's concepts of substance to show how in economy the notion of substance is fundamental in order to make the idea of capitalist exploitation possible. So substance is producible, and this is the first operation of capitalist production, to produce substance. And in fact, when Agamben is speaking of sort of a substantial or quasi-substantial dimension of human potentiality, that's why this gesture is so ambiguous, precisely because this is the operation that contemporary capitalism needs in order to make hegemony over, let's say, subjective forces, or singular subjective forces and force of subjectivation possible. So, for that reason, the decisive question for the political subject today is the techno-aesthetic question. So this brutal and abrupt transformation of the modes of production, of exchange, and of power is, of course, bringing forward the transformation of the very modalities of subjectivation by reducing to commodity the very labor force, therefore by absorbing the potentiality of life through the production of a fiction of a global substance, which is precisely the basic operation of biopolitics. So the production of fiction of a global substance. And the present transformation is radical in a, how should I say, in a quite singular way, to the extent that contemporary biocapitalism, as I'm calling it as well, is of course, is appropriating and reducing to merchandise, to goods, the potential for transformation of forms of life, but not only the forms of life, the initial transformability of human potentiality. And this is this moment of transformability, since I'm usually treated as a mobilist or whatever, a philosopher of movement or of dynamic ontology. For me, this question of transformability is extremely important. So what contemporary capitalist forms of production are trying to co-opt or to absorb or to appropriate is precisely not only forms of life, but this transformability that is immanent to human potentiality. And this is, by the way, let's say, what makes so attractive this, I'll call it quasi-aesthetic horizon of what Richard Florida calls creative capitalism, you know, which makes apologies of mobility, fluidity, of networking, of whatever valence of communication, the dynamic relations, etc., etc. So this is something that Luc Boltanski and F. Capello, in their famous book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, called the connectionist logic of enterprise. So the new capitalism produces, performs, or rather, the new capitalism produces by performing it the plasticity, the modifiability, and even the inorganicity of body, of subject, and therefore of life. So, in a way, it reduces to commodity everything that represented the, let's say, the genuine space of creativity and resistance at the time of 68, or the 60s, and even in the 70s. So the question today is, of course, the question of resistance in that new situation. And according to Virla and Agamben, we either have this kind of a quasi-utopian solutions or no solution at all. I don't even discuss here Tony Negri's idea of exodus, which is more complicated. It's not only, let's say, a messianic exodus. So, I'm jumping so that I don't have much time, 5 more minutes. So my hypothesis in relation to this contemporary biopolitics is that what I call performative capitalism is entirely new form of production of productability. So it's a little bit, sounds tautological, but what is at stake is entirely new, is not the production itself, but how the very productability is produced. And which brings me to the idea that perhaps we should even speak not of biopolitics any longer, but we should rather speak of something like trans-biopolitics. I'll leave, maybe this is a little bit enigmatic because I don't have time to really articulate, so maybe in the debate we will have the occasion to clarify some of this proposal. So, the technical experimentation with the body potentiality, which radicalizes the biopolitical intuitions of modernity by new media technologies and hyper technologies, looks infinite. We can think beyond the standard heroicization of the industrial labor or the working body of today's immaterial performances of, let's say, the new agencies of capital, of the media, new media spectacles, of sort of a transhuman bodies or body cyborgs, whose slogan could be, unlike Men de Biran's slogan, there is no limits for human body, there is no limits for the performances of human body. So, my suggestion is that today we are facing a situation of a politics of perverse plasticity, which liberates the potentiality of body by giving access to a seemingly limitless potential for transformation. So today, the very transformation is becoming a commodity. But in these situations, the bodies themselves, the material bodies, the bodies of the subjects, are treated precisely as subjects. So there is a new reduction to even more typified and codified, standardized, and at the end repressive, normative expectations in relations to form of life, which is precisely, let's say, the constitutive double bind of this new situation which tries to promote human form as form of genuine transformability and in fact exhaust transformability as such. And so how can we resist or rather persist in this new situation of biopolitical transformability, and how subjects could reappropriate their initial transformability that makes them subjects as such. So the first accent of my answer would be a metacritical one. So we should make a very clear distinction between this fluidity of contemporary capitalism, of this immaterial leviathan, and what we can call or describe as resistance or even persistence, which is a concept that I'm trying to develop in these last years, within the metamorphosis. So we need to think of a sort of I would use a scientific term as metastability. So we need not to stop, we need not to think of the paradigm of rupture, of interruption, of seizure, as Agamben does with his messianic event, but we shouldn't promote the endless transformability which could foster even forms of what we would call conformism, right? Because this new regulation, even of our private space, etc., we can enter in the very technical details of social networks, etc., how they promote forms of new conformism, which is replacing modern, banal forms of solidarity. But that's just in brackets. So this would be the first thing, to make a clear distinction between transformation and transformation, which is the reason why I a bit insistently, maybe obsessively speak of or repeat the question, how to transform the transformation. If transformation becomes normative, then we shouldn't abandon transformation and go back to the roots, labor the earth or something like that. We should think how to transform transformation. So, if I allow myself, since Walter Benjamin was one of the conceptual characters of this presentation, if I allow myself at the end to paraphrase Walter Benjamin, another famous phrase by Benjamin, I would say the following. Today, the task, or a possible way, is to experiment in even disorganized way with the body potentiality, which doesn't proceed from a determinate function or exchange value. It should be a sort of a transformative counter-operation of the standardized ways of production of subjectivity, of the codification and the commodification of bodies, of sensations, of thought, emotions, in the political, economic circuit of the global capital, which is trying to reduce the horizon of life to the super-exploited space of the globe. So the resistance of subject means, at the first place, the invention of new, manifest, singular forms of life, which would have the potential to destitute the typified forms of existence, the commercial, performed forms of life. So this manifestation of forms of life, and in their quality of potentiality, is precisely the expression of transformability. So we shouldn't reduce our inventive or imaginative potential to the pre-established, so to say, matrices of forms of production. And here I would paraphrase the famous final sentence of the work of art in the era of its technical reproducibility by Benjamin. You know this phrase, if fascism tries to aestheticize politics, communism answers by politicization of art. And I would say, today the question is not how to bio-aestheticize politics, but how to re-politicize the aesthetics or the bioaesthetics, or rather how to follow its immanent political rhythm. An aesthetic struggle aesthetic struggle for the unimaginable subjects of existence in order to trace the horizon of a possible future. I'll stop here with my...
Благодарам на Boyan Manchev, това беше езотерично и фино, кога спомена како правото е играчка во рацете на децата, тоа не штреца нас овде, ние го имаме тоа искусено и јадено во друг контекст, не онтолошки контекст. Но, благодарам, јас сега ќе отворам простор за прашања и после тоа една информација во Identity Politics, часописот на Distinguished Works Клозова и компанија, ќе излезе дел од текстот облаци на Boyan Manchev, така да можете тамо да го погледнете детално. Тоа така ли е? Коректно ли кажа? Да. За една недела. Значи, јас имам едно прашање кој се врзува за таа фина утопија, но ќе го задржам за крај. Повелете кој...
Да, Игор Котрайер. Male children, their sons into homosexuals, they usually put lipstick on their lips, they dress them in skirts, and because women usually tend to think that girls are much easier to be to have an upbringing than the boys. And I would refer in this context to your quotation that you had from the beginning at the Oedipus Rex, then you mentioned that your colleague that was Jewish from Berlin and the other one. And I would like, my question will refer to with the quote of our lawyer from Macedonia, which is a famous academic, Mirjana Polena, with the inclusion of the introduction from Ivo Tuhan. Her book is the Roman Law and the Right for Private Property. And she says that the private property begins in the moment when the individual has a right of his body. Do you think that in this context, I think that your lecture was about that we can have a fake notion of our body, and in that way we may be disowned by the body. And do you think that now we are entering with this new technology of information and extremely fast living, so to speak, that we can lose our body and we can be enslaved in this manner of which the founder of the psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, has thank you.
The topic that I couldn't really expand, because in this understanding, this transformability that I'm talking about, that's why I said that this book is also dealing with anthropotechnique. So I am very much busy with thinking of human potentiality or transformability as a sort of a composition of techniques. So it's not at all naturalization or substantialization of human potentiality, and our bodies are always, we know that quite well, not only by reading, but they are constructed by a variety of techniques, and they, I mean, maybe not only human bodies, maybe each body, even a cell, has the capacity to exceed itself. Maybe this is the phenomenon of life. Somewhere I wrote something like la vie c'est l'excès de la vie. The life is excess of life. So but this excess of life over itself, I think we can describe it as a technique. So every way of manifestation of life is every, let's say, what steps beyond the organic determination is already a form of technique. So that, in that sense, for me, always I'm a little bit skeptical about the discussion between, so to say, technophiles, technophiles, technophily, and technophobia. You understand? So I'm rather techno-realist, and I think that it's about rather about the use value or the surplus value of technique. So I think each form of technique could be enslaving and emancipatory. And that's quite interesting. I think each technique of reproduction, for instance, Benjamin is talking about, could become a tool of control, of biopolitical even weapon, like cameras everywhere and stuff. Could be also emancipatory tool, or for expression of your own, I don't know, sexualities or bodies, etc., right? So that's a very. I think techniques are neutral in itself. So our subjective investment makes them good or bad. And then this goes back to it's very interesting that you refer to this paragraph in Freud, which for me is quite interesting. I was thinking quite often, by the way, about this idea of Freud, which criminalizes a little bit the child as this kind of sexual pervert with this term of polymorphous perversion, which I think is quite close to what is the idea of human being nowadays, right? So we are all polymorphous perversions.
It is how the fascism was born.
Yes.
With this, because women try to control, tend to control with the subconscious the society by transforming all the boys into girls.
That's quite fine. But I just, maybe it's anecdotic, but think like the contemporary situation, like this time, that's true that boys were dressed up to age of 6 as girls, while today, from the baby, from the trolley, already they are red, not red, sorry, rose and blue. That's shocking. So that these kind of standardized forms are pre-existing the very human existence, isn't it?
Dobro. Ima ošte neko vprašanje?
Right, I was surprised that you began with the fable of Oedipus the king and not Oedipus at columns, because that would be the place to talk about if we're narrating, if we're creating a story around the concept of bare life, because Oedipus at column is bare life. And there we also witnessed this duplicity of the concept, the aspect of the sacred and the aspect of the bare. And would you mind explaining how do you understand this, the double facetedness of the concept of bare life? It's also sacred life or homosacred, it's actually the same, the two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
So why is the bare life, the spendable life, the life that can be exterminated without any legal consequences? Why is it also sacred at the same time? And in which sense is the word sacred used in Agamben? And perhaps from there you can also derive the idea of die-based.
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, I'm dealing shortly with Oedipus and Columbus, but that's true that my main emphasis in my reading was on Oedipus the king. I have to say that, in fact, I maybe created a little bit of a slippery, not slippery, but rather confused idea on the structure of the book, because I think I was telling this to Vicky today. This was meant as 3 volumes initially. So the Oedipus the King is the first volume. The second is not published. It's on Spinoza and Hobbes mostly, and the third one is contemporary debate. So in fact, the main question of my analysis of Oedipus the King was really the foundational acts of political sovereignty, not that much their life. So this comes really in the third volume. So I kind of retroactively projected it on Oedipus the King. But nevertheless, your question is very pertinent and quite important and stimulating, because when I was busy with these classical references, which is part also of my education, but I also have a passion for this, and many friends, brilliant classical philologists and cultural historians. So I studied a lot. First of all, it's quite questionable, this figure of Homo sapiens. I mean, that he takes from Roman archaic law, right? So then I studied a lot of phenomena that in Greece are quite parallel, and then create much different idea on this connection between life and sacred life, so to say. It's very one very interesting thing is that they're very often connected to animal life.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Response. But yeah, I should have mentioned that I find it an error actually in Agamben to skip Greek antiquity, because you have the example of Homo sapiens. What was the word in Greek now?
Yes.
Never mind, I'm blocked, but I will remember later. And it is exactly the same thing. And Oedipus is the paradigmatic figure. So it's this Latinocentrism of Agamben is a problem, because the idea is even the duplicity is elaborated in Oedipus. I mean, I'm just inviting the discussion. I'm expecting you would provide. So it's not a provocation.
In fact, Sophocles uses this term hypsopolis, which means someone who is basically under the polis, who is expelled by the polis, and so he's becoming apolis. And this apolis is very much close to bad life. One of my philosophical heroes, perhaps many of you, is Heraclitus. And of course it's a legendary character, but if you remember how Diogenes Laertius is describing his death, it's a legendary, terrible death, that he is in fact torn apart by dogs, because he was covered with mud, because he wanted to cure himself, and because he believed in this omnipotential element of the fire, so he needed some mud to take the fire out. So because of his philosophical concept, he became a body of a philosophical concept, and that's why he died as inhuman creature, because to be torn apart by wild beasts is the worst death according to the Greeks, right? And also, I think some of our common friends write about this, maybe not of common friends, because I don't. Anyways, I think this was rather Nicole Hope, who unfortunately passed away, but she writes about a ritual like female suicide, right? Which is like hanging yourself, like Antigone and many other women, which is apolitic, right? Exactly. So, and in this precisely the connection between, let's say, this kind of dispensable and sacred is it's quite ambiguous. So I think I'm not sure to what extent we can follow Agamben in his reading of classical texts. So what's sure is that Benjamin definitely really disrupts any connection of sanctity of life and the idea of this kind of dispensable character of life. So I didn't have time to deal with this. Maybe my reading of Benjamin is also pushing it into too much, let's say, Marxist or revolutionary or crypto-anarchist position. But what comes out from my reading of Critique of the Gewalt is that it's in fact apology of revolutionary terror. which is quite interesting because Agamben was writing on these issues and appropriating many of these concepts precisely at the time of war on terror, right? So basically, and Agamben is taking various critical concepts in order to describe, so to say, the victims, while Benjamin wanted to describe the subjects, so to say.
Dobro, vi благодарам многу на Манчев посебно за ова задоволство што ни го направи вечерва и да го завршиме, да го привршиме ова предание. Уште една благодарност до вас и до гостинот. Гледаме с убаво заедно во следната сесија на критичко преиспитување на правото. Благодарам.